The Browning M250 caliber machine gun earned its nickname Ma Deuce for good reason. When John Moses Browning finalized the design in 1921, he created what military historians still call the most successful heavy machine gun in history. This weapon could punch through engine blocks at 500 yards, tear apart light armor, and send a half-inch diameter projectile screaming downrange at 2,900 feet per second. By 1942, every American infantry company in the Pacific wanted as many of these monsters as they could get. The psychological impact alone was worth its weight in gold. Japanese soldiers called it the woodpecker of death because of its distinctive firing rhythm. But here's what the recruiting posters never mentioned. The M2 had a fatal flaw that every machine gunner learned to fear. The weapon could theoretically fire 450 to 600 rounds per minute, but in practice you had maybe 90 to 120 seconds of sustained fire before the laws of physics turned your best friend into a useless hunk of metal. The problem wasn't ammunition. A well-supplied crew could keep feeding that beast for hours. The problem was heat, and it was a problem that could get you killed. Every time the M2's firing pin struck a primer, it ignited 240 grains of smokeless powder that generated approximately 18,000 foot-pounds of energy. Most of that energy propelled the bullet forward, but about 30% converted directly into thermal energy. With each round, the barrel absorbed roughly 5,400 foot-pounds of heat. Fire 100 rounds in rapid succession, and you're pumping 540,000 foot-pounds of thermal energy into a steel tube that weighs just 26 pounds. The math was simple and brutal. After 2 minutes of sustained fire, the barrel temperature climbed past 800 degrees Fahrenheit. Push it to 3 minutes and you're flirting with 1,100 degrees. At 1,200 degrees Fahrenheit, the barrel steel began to lose its structural integrity. The Army Ordnance Department knew this, of course. The technical manual issued to every M2 crew included explicit warnings printed in bold letters. Sustained fire exceeding 2 minutes will result in barrel failure. The consequences of ignoring this warning ranged from bad to catastrophic. Best case scenario, the barrel warped slightly and your accuracy went to hell. Bullets started keyholing, tumbling sideways through the air instead of flying true. Worst case, the barrel actually ruptured, sending shrapnel back into your face and rendering the weapon permanently disabled. Mid-range on the disaster scale, the headspace, that critical gap between the bolt face and the barrel, would expand from thermal deformation, causing rounds to detonate prematurely in the chamber. Gunsmiths called this a cook-off, and it could turn a controlled weapon into an uncontrolled one real fast. Standard doctrine addressed this limitation head-on. Every M2 position required a spare barrel and a crew trained in the barrel change procedure. Swap the barrel every 90 seconds, let the hot one cool for 20 minutes, and you could theoretically maintain fire indefinitely. The barrel change itself took about 30 to 45 seconds if your crew was good, maybe 60 seconds if you were working in the dark or under fire. The Army even issued asbestos gloves specifically for handling hot barrels, though most crews found them too bulky and just used rags or their uniform sleeves. But all of this assumed one critical thing. You had time to stop shooting. Black Saturday on Henderson Ridge, Guadalcanal in November 1942 was where the Empire of Japan came to test whether American forces could be driven back into the sea. The island, roughly 90 miles long and 25 miles wide, had become the focal point of the entire Pacific War after Marines landed there on August 7th. By November, the fighting had devolved into a brutal stalemate centered around Henderson Field, the only operational airstrip in the Solomon Islands. Whoever controlled that airstrip controlled the sky, and whoever controlled the sky would win the Pacific. The Marines had established a defensive perimeter around Henderson Field, but that perimeter was stretched thin, very thin. The 1st Marine Division had been fighting for 3 months straight, taking casualties daily, and reinforcements were arriving slower than men were falling. On the night of November 12th, intelligence reports indicated a major Japanese offensive was coming. They were right. What those reports failed to capture was the scale. This wasn't going to be a probing attack or a harassment mission. Imperial General Headquarters had committed the entire 38th Infantry Division, fresh troops from Japan, with orders to break through the American lines and retake Henderson Field at any cost. Marine Corporal Anthony Stein, known to his squad as Tony, held a position on what the maps designated as Hill 132, though everyone called it Henderson Ridge. The ridge formed a natural barrier on the southern approach to the airfield, elevated about 50 feet above the surrounding jungle. Stein's M250 caliber was positioned to cover a draw, a natural corridor between two higher hills where the vegetation thinned out just enough to create a kill zone about 80 yards deep and 40 yards wide. Military analysts would later call it a textbook defensive position. Stein called it a death trap, because if the Japanese came through that draw in force, his three-man gun crew would be the only thing stopping them from rolling up the entire right flank. The attack began at 02:30 hours on November 13th. No artillery preparation, no warning, just shapes moving in the darkness, lots of them, advancing with the kind of discipline that comes from professional soldiers who've trained together for years. The 38th Division wasn't green troops. These men had combat experience in Manchuria and China. They knew what they were doing. Stein's assistant gunner, Private Eddie Morrison, spotted them first through the darkness, estimating at least 200 men forming up in the tree line, maybe more. They were carrying Bangalore torpedoes to breach the wire, scaling ladders to cross the defensive trenches, and enough small arms ammunition to sustain an assault for hours. This is where the math turned ugly. Standard defensive doctrine called for short controlled bursts, 5 to 7 rounds, then pause to assess. Conserve ammunition, prevent barrel overheating, maintain weapon reliability. But Stein could see what was developing in front of him. This wasn't a situation where controlled bursts would cut it. The Japanese were massing for a human wave attack, the kind where they just kept coming regardless of casualties until they either broke through or ran out of men. If Stein fired in short bursts, enough Japanese soldiers would survive to cross the kill zone and overrun his position. Once they got past his gun, they'd be behind the defensive line with nothing but scattered rifle squads between them and the airfield. Stein had 2 spare barrels. Following doctrine, that gave him maybe 6 minutes of total firing time spread over 30 minutes of combat, accounting for barrel changes and cooling. His loader, Private First Class Jack Chen, had 12 ammunition cans stacked within arm's reach. 600 rounds ready to go, with runners standing by to bring more. The ammunition wasn't the problem. Time was the problem. And Stein was looking at an assault force that would take at least 8 to 10 minutes of sustained fire to stop. The science of failure, the engineers at Colt's Patent Firearms, manufacturing company who produced most of the M2 barrels, during WWII used a steel alloy designated as SAE 4150. This chromium molybdenum steel was chosen specifically for its ability to withstand repeated thermal cycling and maintain structural integrity under stress. The manufacturing process involved gun drilling a solid steel billet, then rifling the interior with 4 grooves. Here's where material science became a matter of life and death. That heat treatment created a microstructure in the steel that could handle thermal stress up to a point. But steel's mechanical properties degrade in a predictable curve as temperature rises. At 600 degrees Fahrenheit, SAE 4150 steel retains about 90% of its room temperature strength. At 900 degrees, you're down to 70%. At 1100 degrees, you've lost half your strength. And at 1200 degrees Fahrenheit, the temperature that M2 barrels reached after about 150 to 180 seconds of sustained fire, the steel retained only 40% of its original tensile strength. The barrel was still solid metal, still looked normal, but it was structurally compromised in ways that could manifest instantly and catastrophically. The failure modes varied, but gunners learned to recognize the warning signs. First came the accuracy degradation. As the barrel heated and expanded, the rifling grooves widened microscopically, causing the bullet to lose its stabilizing spin. Rounds that should group within a 6-inch circle at 100 yards started spreading to 18 or 24 inches. Tracers, which made up every 5th round in standard M2 ammunition belts, began drawing weird curving paths through the air instead of straight lines. Smart gunners watched their tracers religiously. When they started spiraling, you had maybe 20 seconds before serious problems began. Next came the headspace issue, and this is where things got dangerous fast. The headspace on an M2 was the gap between the bolt face and the base of the cartridge when the round was chambered, properly set at 0.063 inches. As the barrel heated and expanded, that gap grew. If it grew too much, the cartridge case wouldn't be properly supported when the firing pin struck. The primer would fire, pressure would build, and the unsupported brass case would rupture. Sometimes this just meant extraction failures and jams. Sometimes it meant hot gases and brass fragments venting back through the receiver into the gunner's face. The worst-case scenario was thermal runaway. At extreme temperatures, the chamber itself became hot enough to ignite the powder in a chambered round without the firing pin ever striking the primer. This cook-off would fire the round, chamber the next one, which would also cook off, creating a runaway gun that fired uncontrollably until the belt ran out. You couldn't stop it. The trigger was irrelevant. Your only option was to break the ammunition belt, and if you were in the middle of combat, that might not be feasible or safe. Marine Corps after-action reports from Guadalcanal documented 23 separate instances of M2 barrel failures during the first 3 months of fighting. 7 resulted in complete barrel ruptures. 4 caused serious injuries to gun crews. In one particularly grim incident on October 8, 1942, a cook-off killed a corporal from the 1st Battalion, 7th Marines, when the runaway gun traversed on its mount and swept rounds across his own position. A machinist's answer, Anthony Peter Stein, was 23 years old on November 13, 1942, which made him one of the older men in his squad. He'd grown up in Dayton, Ohio, where his father worked as a tool and die maker at National Cash Register Company. Tony followed his father into machining, spending 3 years learning precision metalwork before the war started. That background mattered more than anyone realized at the time, because Stein understood machines at an intuitive level that most 23-year-olds didn't. He knew what metal did under stress. He'd seen steel warp from heat, watched tolerances shift as components expanded, and learned how to work within or around those limitations. Now he stood behind that weapon, watching shapes multiply in the darkness, and his mind was working through calculations that had nothing to do with courage and everything to do with arithmetic. The Japanese were coming in waves, not all at once. The assault would last at least 5 minutes from first contact to the final enemy soldier, either dead or driven back. To maintain effective fire throughout that 5-minute window, accounting for barrel changes, Stein would need to actually shoot for approximately 8 to 10 minutes total. He had 3 barrels. Standard procedure gave him 6 minutes of firing time spread over 30 minutes. He was at least 2 minutes short, probably 4 minutes short if things went badly. And things always went badly. Stein made his decision in about 5 seconds, which is all the time he had before the Japanese started moving. What he did next violated every technical manual, every regulation, and every piece of official doctrine the Marine Corps had ever written about the M2 Browning. But it was based on solid thermodynamic principles that any machinist would understand, even if every officer in the Corps would have court-martialed him for even suggesting it. The concept was evaporative cooling, the same physics that makes you feel cold when you step out of a swimming pool on a windy day. When liquid water converts to vapor, it absorbs an enormous amount of energy, approximately 540 calories per gram at sea level. Apply liquid to a superheated metal surface and you create an extremely efficient heat transfer mechanism. The liquid absorbs thermal energy from the metal, converts to steam, and carries that energy away into the atmosphere. Industrial machining operations had used liquid cooling for decades by 1942. The problem with cooling an M2 barrel in combat was simple logistics. You needed a liquid. You needed it immediately available, and you needed a lot of it. Water was ideal from a thermodynamic standpoint, but water was precious on Guadalcanal. Canteens were for drinking, not wasting on weapons. Besides, in the middle of a night assault, you used what you had within arm's reach. What Stein had within arm's reach was urine, his own, Morrison's, Chen's, and that of any other Marine in the immediate area. Human urine is approximately 95% water, with the remaining 5% being dissolved urea, creatinine, uric acid, and various salts. From a heat transfer perspective, it's almost as effective as pure water. The liquid would flash to steam regardless. Corps regulations explicitly prohibited what Stein was about to do, though the specific wording was buried in Technical Manual TM 9-1052-213. The manual stated, "Under no circumstances should gunners attempt to cool barrels using non-approved liquids, including seawater, alcohol, petroleum products, or bodily fluids." The regulation existed because previous wars had taught the Army that soldiers would try anything in desperation. Stein didn't care about regulations. He cared about math, physics, and the 200 Japanese soldiers who were about to rush his position. 10 minutes of hell. The first burst went out at 0237 hours, 35 rounds that cut through the lead Japanese section like a saw through bamboo. Stein worked the trigger in controlled patterns while his mind tracked a different problem. He had maybe 90 seconds before the first barrel change. Morrison already had one of the empty ammo cans positioned next to the gun, and both he and Chen knew what was about to happen because Stein had explained it in about 15 seconds of whispered instructions that probably violated 3 or 4 articles of military justice. The Japanese kept coming. The second wave was already moving before the first wave survivors hit the dirt. Stein put another 40 rounds into the mass of advancing soldiers, walking the fire from left to right across the kill zone. The muzzle flash lit up the night like a strobe light, illuminating targets with perfect clarity for half-second intervals. He could see faces, young faces, determined faces, terrified faces. He kept firing. At 92 seconds, the barrel was approaching critical temperature. The tracers were starting to spiral slightly, that telltale sign that the rifling was losing its grip on the bullets. He yelled, "Barrel!" over the gun's hammering. Morrison had the barrel release mechanism open in 12 seconds. Chen was ready with the empty ammo can. Stein grabbed the hot barrel from Morrison, held it horizontal, and Chen poured the contents directly onto the steel. The effect was instantaneous and dramatic. The liquid hit metal that was somewhere north of 1,000 degrees Fahrenheit and converted to steam so fast it created a sound like a pressure cooker venting. The cloud of vapor that erupted from the barrel was thick, white, and smelled exactly like you'd expect. Stein rotated the barrel, letting Chen hit every side, ensuring even cooling. The entire process took maybe 8 seconds. Steam was still rising from the barrel when Morrison slammed the fresh barrel into place and locked it down. Total weapon downtime, 20 seconds. Stein was back on the trigger, firing into the second wave that had used those 20 seconds to get 15 yards closer. He burned through another 80 rounds, watching the Japanese ranks thin but not break. They were committed. The smell was atrocious. Ammonia from the decomposing urea mixed with cordite smoke and the metallic tang of vaporized steel created an atmosphere that would make you gag if you weren't too busy trying to stay alive. Stein's eyes were watering, partly from the chemical assault on his sinuses and partly from the smoke and muzzle flash. He didn't care. The gun was still firing, still putting rounds on target, and that was literally the only thing that mattered. At 4 minutes into the engagement, Stein was on his second barrel change. The first cooled barrel had been sitting for 3 minutes and was ready to go back into service. Chen hit it with another round of liquid cooling as insurance, producing another cloud of steam that briefly obscured the entire gun position. The Japanese must have seen those steam clouds and wondered what kind of weapon the Americans had deployed. The engagement lasted 9 minutes and 40 seconds from first shot to last. Stein fired 847 rounds total, rotating through his 3 barrels 4 complete cycles, with Chen performing emergency cooling on each barrel twice. The gun never jammed, never misfired, never failed. The sun came up 6 hours later and revealed what they'd done. Bodies were stacked in overlapping rows across the kill zone, thickest at about 40 yards out where the second and third waves had collided with the first wave's casualties. The Division Graves Registration Unit spent 2 days cataloging the dead in front of Stein's position. Official count, 73 confirmed enemy KIA directly attributable to the M2 position on Henderson Ridge. The unofficial commendation, Lieutenant Colonel Louis Chesty Puller, commanding the 1st Battalion, 7th Marines, walked the position at 8 hours. Puller was already a legend in the Corps. He looked at the body count, looked at Stein's gun, then looked at the empty ammo can sitting next to the position. One of them still had liquid pooled in the bottom. Puller stuck his finger in it, sniffed it, and said something that has appeared in at least 6 different versions in various historical accounts. The printable version is, "Corporal, what in the name of God is this?" Stein told him all of it. The thermal calculations, the evaporative cooling principle, the emergency barrel cooling procedure that had kept the gun firing for nearly 10 minutes straight. Puller listened, his face completely neutral, while Morrison and Chen stood at attention, expecting to be arrested on the spot. What's documented in the 1st Marine Division records is that on November 15, 1942, Puller submitted a commendation report citing extraordinary initiative and technical innovation, under combat conditions for Corporal Stein. That commendation worked its way up the chain and eventually became a Bronze Star recommendation, which was upgraded to a Silver Star by Major General Alexander Vandegrift himself. But the Marine Corps was also institutionally horrified. Within a week, Stein was summoned to division headquarters to demonstrate his cooling technique for a panel that included 2 lieutenant colonels from Ordnance and a major from the Judge Advocate General's office. The JAG officer made it very clear that unauthorized modifications to weapons procedures violated Article 92 of the Articles of War. The penalty ranged from reduction in rank to dishonorable discharge. The ordnance officers, however, wanted details. They made Stein repeat his cooling procedure 6 times while they measured barrel temperature, timing, and effectiveness. The test results from that November 1942 demonstration, filed as Restricted Report 0421-1173, contradicted 20 years of accepted doctrine about barrel cooling. A barrel at 1500 degrees Fahrenheit dropped to 680 degrees in approximately 15 seconds when treated with Stein's technique. Air cooling that same barrel from 1500 to 680 degrees required 7 minutes and 20 seconds. The liquid cooling method was roughly 29 times faster. The Marine Corps faced an institutional dilemma. They couldn't officially endorse urinating on machine guns. The optics were terrible. The health concerns were real. But they also couldn't ignore results. Stein had achieved something that shouldn't have been possible according to every technical manual. Sustained fire that exceeded the weapon's theoretical limits without catastrophic failure. The solution was typically bureaucratic. They didn't approve it, but they didn't court-martial anyone either. The incident was quietly noted in training materials as an example of unauthorized field modifications that, while effective in specific circumstances, remained prohibited under standard operating procedures. What changed was the doctrine around spare barrels and barrel changing. Pre-Guadalcanal, most M2 positions carried 1 spare barrel. Post-Guadalcanal, the standard increased to 2 spares minimum, 3 when logistics allowed. The emphasis on barrel changing speed increased dramatically. Training cycles that previously allocated 2 hours to barrel changing. Drills expanded to 8 hours. The post-war development of quick-change barrel systems owed a direct debt to incidents like Stein's. The M2HB, model that entered service in 1945, featured an improved barrel release mechanism that reduced change time. The M60 machine gun introduced in 1957 was designed from the ground up with quick barrel changes as a primary requirement. Tony Stein survived Guadalcanal and fought through the rest of the Pacific Campaign. He earned a battlefield commission to 2nd lieutenant at Bougainville in 1943, survived the Hell of Peleliu in 1944, and landed with the 5th Marine Division at Iwo Jima on February 19, 1945. On that black sand beach, Stein led 8 separate charges against Japanese pillboxes, personally destroying 4 enemy positions and evacuating wounded Marines under fire. He was killed by sniper fire on the 3rd day of the battle. President Harry Truman awarded him the Medal of Honor posthumously. The citation mentioned his extraordinary heroism and conspicuous gallantry, but it didn't mention Henderson Ridge or the night he kept a gun firing for 10 minutes straight, using nothing but physics, desperation, and available liquids. The M2 Browning he used that night in 1942 is serial number 324775. It survived the war, served in Korea, and was finally retired from active service in 1968. It now sits in the National Museum of the Marine Corps at Quantico, Virginia. The placard doesn't mention the cooling trick. Some stories the Corps prefers to keep among Marines who understand that winning battles sometimes requires breaking rules that weren't written for the specific kind of hell you're facing. The men who held Henderson Ridge that November night knew the truth. Sometimes innovation smells bad, violates regulations, and saves lives anyway. That's not in any manual, but it should be.